Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
On this week's program, Dr. Kathryn Pearson of the University of Minnesota offers election analysis as we enter the final stretch. Also, Department of Agriculture Commissioner Thom Petersen conveys the state of Minnesota's ag economy. Stay tuned for this and more on this week's Capitol Report. Welcome to this week's program. I'm Shannon Loehrke. This election year seems like no other in history, with the pandemic, protests against racial injustice, and natural disasters. This week, I spoke with University of Minnesota political science professor Dr. Kathryn Pearson about the coming election, and I began by asking her what, in Minnesota's political landscape, jumps out at her.
There's no question that it is a volatile election, that constantly there's new information, news is breaking, and that people are very concerned about the state of the country, the state of the state. And so partisans on both sides of the aisle are thinking more about the election than usual. And I expect that voter turnout will be very high. So there's a lot about this election that's very unusual. But that said, I do expect that just like in typical contemporary elections, 90% of Republicans will vote for the Republican candidates and 90% of Democrats will vote for the Democratic candidates. So even though this election, for many reasons, is more intense, I actually don't expect that there's going to be a lot of persuasion happening from one party to the other.
What about those undecideds, though?
There are certainly undecideds, and in a state as narrowly divided as Minnesota, undecideds can make a critical difference. But there are many fewer undecideds than there used to be. Political science research is pretty clear about that, and that even people who identify initially in polls as, well, I'm an independent, but I lean toward this party or lean toward the other party, the party that they say they lean toward, they actually vote with pretty consistently. And so people may think of themselves as sort of independent and discerning, but most people do lean toward one party or the other. And among those who don't, there are often those who make up their mind at the very last minute because they don't pay a lot of attention to politics until the last minute. But again, in such a volatile year with so much going on, I think a lot of people are paying a lot more attention to politics than usual.
President Trump has nominated Judge Amy Coney Barrett to succeed Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It appears likely that the U.S. Senate will that they will confirm her. What, if any, impact do you see this having on Minnesota's election?
I see there's going to be a lot of conversation about this and on both sides of the aisle, but I don't expect that it would change many people's vote choice. It may change sort of the considerations, the priorities when people are thinking about who they're going to vote for, but it's unlikely that for all but a very narrow segment of voters that it would change this election, because it's not surprising that President Trump appoints a Supreme Court justice. It was sort of with a similar ideology to his other picks. And it's not surprising that Democrats are upset, both about the judicial philosophy of the nominee, but that also in an election year so close to the election that Republicans are going ahead with this, when in 2016, Republican leader Mitch McConnell and Republicans in the Senate wouldn't consider President Obama's nominee, Merrick Garland. And so the Senate confirmation will certainly take up a lot of, time in the media, and people will be focused on it, but it also won't take away from other concerns like COVID-19, the economy, and other concerns on voters' minds. So once again, this is just an election with so many issues at the forefront, but these issues are by and large not necessarily going to change very many people's minds, only solidify and harden the support for the candidates that they were already inclined to support.
Well, and this next question may piggyback on what you just said a little bit, because most days the presidential election sucks the air out of the room. But in terms of statewide offices, how long are those coattails? You mentioned independents really lean one way or another way, but with this presidential race, how big is that impact on statewide elections?
Well, it matters. It matters because political science research shows that increasingly people do not split their votes when it comes to voting for a presidential candidate of one party and a member of Congress or a congressional candidate of another party. It used to actually be quite common that incumbents would win by wide margins, even if voters were casting a vote for an incumbent and a presidential candidate of another party. And now, by and large, voters tend to vote for the same party all the way down, or at least most of the way down the ticket. Now, there's some notable exceptions to that, like in Minnesota's 7th district, where, for example, 4 years ago, President Trump won Minnesota's 7th congressional district by about 20 points, and incumbent Democrat Kathryn Pearson was reelected. And so there are races like that where the incumbent's fate depends on voters splitting their ticket. But by and large across the country, especially when candidates are less well known to people, people don't tend to vote to split their ticket in the way that they used to.
You've written a book on how party leaders wield their power to reward or punish members and maintain discipline in the United States House of Representatives. I wonder, are those political tactics trickling down to state levels now in terms of party leaders using those same kinds of tactics to keep their party members in line?
To a certain extent, yes. With 50 states, there is some variation, but we see over and over again the trends of partisan polarization and party unity within each party and against the other party being very high. And that divided government, which actually right now, Minnesota is the only state that has a state house of one party and a state senate of the other, that, the parties are really at odds with one another, and party leaders need, especially when the margins are close, party leaders need that loyalty of every member. And so whether it's leadership races or committee assignments or getting one's bills to the floor, party loyalty does matter, and party leaders take that into consideration, whether in the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate, or in state houses across the country. There are some caveats to that, and that is, as we get close to an election, party leaders also want to make sure that they can really help their most vulnerable incumbents get reelected. So if they're going to give some members a pass, it's going to be those vulnerable members who need to win for a party to either keep their majority or get to majority party status.
Now, many analysts, including you, now see Minnesota as a swing state. Is the makeup of political parties changing in Minnesota? In other words, is the DFL party losing some of those farmers and laborers?
Yes, it is. And we see similar trends in Minnesota that we're seeing at the national level. So in sparsely populated, more rural areas of the state, we're seeing Republicans making inroads. We see that all over the country, and we're seeing it in Minnesota. Minnesota's 1st district in southern Minnesota, Minnesota's 8th district in northern Minnesota, those were two of the only districts in 2018 that actually switched from Democrat to Republican, where at the same time in Minnesota, you had Minnesota's 2nd district and 3rd district switched from Republican to Democratic because, like the rest of the country, those suburban and exurban areas are increasingly going Democratic. And so Minnesota's geography is such that the party alignments are more in sync with the rest of the country. But yes, Democrats are losing a lot of ground in more sparsely populated areas of greater Minnesota because that DFL farmer labor coalition has really broken up.
Now, this may be a little bit out of your wheelhouse, but I'd like you to weigh in on the social media outlets like Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. How are they shaping the tone and the rhetoric and the divisiveness that we're seeing in today's political environment, particularly, at the state level, but it's happening nationally as well?
Well, there's no doubt that they are intensifying the partisan conflict that we're already seeing, and the social media and all that goes with that really makes it even harder for parties to work across the aisle and compromise, because the minute someone reaches out to the other party, it's all over social media, and one's own partisans are going to get very upset. Now, sometimes social media can have the benefit of spreading knowledge and information to voters who might not otherwise get it, but the problem is it's filtered. And so people aren't getting news from multiple sources, typically through social media. It tends to be their own bubble reinforcing partisan views, and indeed sometimes news that's just not accurate, or news that may have some truth, but without any context can be misleading.
We are still 4 weeks away from Election Day, and as we are noticing, breaking news is constant. For example, the New York Times has new reports on President Trump's tax returns. Here in Minnesota, we have reports of ballot harvesting. Do these so-called October surprises still impact the election?
Well, I think, in both cases, context is necessary, and that it also depends on how the follow-up goes. I expect that we'll be hearing a lot more, both from former Vice President Biden, but also other Democrats, about President Trump's taxes. And so the extent to which Democrats can sort of use that successfully, I think will determine how great of a campaign issue it is for Democrats. But I also think it's very likely that strong supporters of the president really won't be swayed by this information. President Trump has already made clear over the past several years that he doesn't think that the New York Times is a credible source of information. The fact checking of this reporting notwithstanding. And so I think it really depends on how independent voters, and again, there are fewer of them, but how independent viewers, how often they see this information and the context that's provided, and then any follow-up with the information about ballots as well. I just think in that particular case, a lot more investigation will be done and a lot of fact-checking, and that will sort of determine how this plays out.
Dr. Kathryn Pearson, I want to thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Agriculture is an integral part of Minnesota's economy, and the Minnesota Department of Agriculture offers a variety of aids to farmers and livestock producers. This week, I spoke with Agriculture Commissioner Thom Petersen, and I began by asking for his assessment of Minnesota's farm economy.
That's really an interesting issue, and something that I look at every day is that, where are we at? And right now here in late September, early October, things have kind of looked up, from where we've been at the whole year. For Minnesota, our crop situation looks great. And I think that's really important. When we look around the country, Minnesota may have some of the best crops in the whole country this year. We've had areas where we've had issues, but we haven't had like Iowa and other problems that they've had. So the first thing is that our farmers right now in harvest season, we're going to have a good corn crop, maybe a bin buster type situation. Our dairy prices are up, our meat plants are working, our local food market's thriving. So for the state of agriculture right now, it's pretty strong in Minnesota considering COVID and everything going on. That's not to say there aren't farmers that are having a hard time, because keep in mind, Shannon, that we've had almost 6 years of low prices before COVID even hit. So farmers lost their equity. We have almost 1,000 farmers in mediation in Minnesota. We're in the top 5 in farm bankruptcies. So there is a lot of unfortunate issues, but in general, for me, the positive right now is the harvest and going forward with that.
So the good prices for crops and other commodities are going to help farmers who've been hurting these last few years.
They have, and different things have started to help and trend some of our prices upward, and that's good news. We've also had payments from the federal government that have helped plug some holes from the farmers and have provided a lot of income for farmers. That is important. But, I think it's important. Farmers want to get their dollars from the marketplace. That's really where we want it to work. So we'll see how it plays out. But right now, things are at least trending up for the minute.
October is National Farm to School Month, and here in Minnesota, there's a series of virtual farm to school field trips throughout the month of October. Can you tell us about this program?
Yeah, I'm just very proud of our staff and our partners that have worked really hard in COVID to be creative, and we found that in general, we would try to do on-farm visits or on-farm tours. But actually, before COVID even started, our department started looking at in our farm to school program on how we could highlight some of these farms for schools. And so we have a great Ag in the Classroom program. We have a great farm to school program. October is farm to school month, and it's challenging with COVID. right now too. Our kids going to school, sometimes that's one of the important meals they get every day is at a school. So the efforts are really to provide nutritious, homegrown food for farmers, from farmers, and connect them, the students, with farmers. And Minnesota's a leader in this program, and just look forward to having October as Farm to School month.
One of the Farm to School tours is a visit to Revel Greens, which is an Owatonna-based indoor lettuce company that just recently announced plans to expand into other states. To what degree is a company like this the future of farming?
Yeah, really interesting. I've been able to tour some of the indoor lettuce farms, and really interesting to see. Lettuce is a tough crop to raise. You're probably familiar with E. coli, pesticide use, a lot of questions about lettuce. And so this has been a successful business. We wish they would be expanding in Minnesota, but we have other farms such as Living Greens and different ones that are doing very well in Minnesota. I see it as a future for large scale production because of E. coli, but also water use. Water use is very important. Using a closed loop system is really helpful in agriculture. We also have a real thriving lettuce market for smaller farms that serve like farmers markets and CSAs. And so we have kind of a well-rounded business model in Minnesota.
Right now, Minnesota has plenty of water, but if models predicting that other parts of the country are going to become inhabitable in the future, and then, Minnesota warms, thereby increasing our growing season, will climate change put more pressure on Minnesota to diversify crops and farming practices?
Absolutely. And it's not only will, it is, and I think it's something that farmers can see, that I can see in my time on our farm and our area. And I think that the idea is that farmers can be part of the solution as we get into climate change, that, there's different things that farmers can be doing. We're being very aggressive in looking at and supporting third crops and perennial crops on the landscape. Cover cropping in Minnesota has really taken off with farmers really experimenting. We have a water quality certification program at the department where we have well over 600,000 acres and almost 1,000 farmers in that, but we've added a lot of cover crops that help protect water quality, but also will help us with climate issues as we get into the future. So it's a top priority for the Walz administration, and we'll have to just keep working on it.
On the DNR website, one can find a map that shows how the wolf range has expanded since 1979. It's growing to the southwest. It now includes Malacca, Little Falls, Detroit Lakes, and Thief River Falls, almost a half of the state. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife is offering grants to livestock producers to prevent wolf livestock conflicts. The amount of money available is $60,000. What do livestock owners need to know, and is $60,000 enough?
That's a great question, Shannon, and I'm coming to you from my farm here in Pine City today where I can hear the wolves, and I'm in the wolf range and very familiar with the issue. And the grant that we've been working on with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is something we've had for a couple of years now. The Department of Ag also has an indemnity for farmers who lose livestock to wolf attacks. And so since early summer, we've had almost 80 different reports and cases of wolves and livestock conflicts so we've worked hard to mitigate that with these grants from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And we are actually in the third year of this grant. And so we're trying to quantify how it's going. We think it's going good because actually those numbers are down a little bit. And so the idea of fencing out wolves, scaring them away, different things is a real positive or something we can work together.
The Minnesota Department of Agriculture has agricultural growth research and innovation program. It's abbreviated AGRI or AGRI. It provides grants to many small agricultural producers and helps them launch and sustain their efforts. The application period for grants for 2021 is now open, and the website says there's $1 million available. Also, according to the website, grants for 2021 will prioritize the mitigation of impacts of COVID-19 and also civil unrest. So what are some examples of projects that could receive funding?
Yeah, and thanks. That's a great question. You know, we've really looked at civil unrest issues as they happened through the Twin Cities, and if there were egg processing companies that were affected by that, there were some smaller ones. So we wanted to give them an offer to get up back and rebuild and using those Minnesota agricultural products. And so we'll see, hopefully we get some questions from that. One of the top priorities for us is meat processing on a smaller level. Before COVID, as COVID went in, farmer people started buying locally from farmers at a very high rate, buying directly meat, buying from the local butchers, and that really put a lot on the market. As we got into the meat processing plant shutdowns, that created a huge backup as we had to euthanize almost 350,000 pigs, and we gave away about another 150,000 that went into these local markets. And so that's created a large backup, but the demand is incredible right now. And so that's another piece we're putting a highlight on in these grants. And then also hemp processing. We have almost 500 farmers growing hemp in Minnesota, and we look forward to really building that up as well.
Commissioner Thom Petersen, I want to thank you for taking the time.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to visit today.
We close this week with a look at gubernatorial portraiture in the Capitol. The official state portrait of Mark Dayton, the 40th governor of Minnesota, was recently unveiled in a ceremony held in the Rotunda. It hangs in the west wing of the Capitol on the ground floor in a corridor with Governor Tim Pawlenty, Governor Jesse Ventura, and around the corner, Governor Arne Carlson. These are all portraits, though, paintings, not photographs. Why is that?
Well, the importance of oil on canvas is the permanence, because if you had a photograph, that's going to fade over time. And so the goal of the Minnesota Historical Society and the Capital Area Architectural Planning Board is to have a piece of art that's going to be there for decades and generations to come. So you want something that's a traditional oil painting on a canvas.
These paintings differ remarkably over the years. Alexander Ramsey, Henry Sibley, those are small paintings. Some, like Governor Arne Carlson, are quite large. What explains the differences in the size and how these paintings are the decisions that are made?
Yeah, that's a really interesting story to tell about the portraits, because what you are looking at is you're looking at portraits from the 1850s all the way up to the present day. And so you get a really good story about art history and how portraits were done. So you have very traditional, very formal paintings from the 1850s, the 1890s, early 1900s, the traditional governor with the hand in the coat, you know, that type of thing. And then you start in the 1930s having a little bit more personalization of the governor. So Floyd B. Olson was the first kind of a little bit more less formal painting. He's portrayed standing in front of the Capitol. The Capitol's behind him, and he's holding a microphone for the radio. And he was one of the first governors to really use that technology to have these statewide conversations over the radio. So that was kind of a nice little kind of a part of his administration as a governor, and a part of his personality, very charismatic, very outgoing.
I noticed in Governor Arne Carlson's portrait there are two butterflies, a blue and a yellow bird. Also in Governor Jesse Ventura's, there's Rodin's The Thinker, and there's a train in the background. What do these symbols indicate? Well,
it really typifies some of their achievements as a governor. The process for the last several decades is the governor, when they finish their term of office, gets to select their portrait artist and also what they want to be portrayed as, or how they want to be remembered in that portrait. So they work with the artist to work out some of those details. And so once again, if you look at some of the more recent portraits from in the last 30, 40 years, you do have characteristics or things that identify that person's interest. So we can go back to Al Quie, has horses in the background. Well, he's an avid horse rider, and has been his whole entire life. So those are his horses that are being portrayed in that painting. And you have Arne Carlson as the butterflies. One is a butterfly you find in Sweden. One is a butterfly you find in Minnesota because he has Swedish roots. He's of Swedish-American descent. So it makes the things very personalized for these governors to have those stories told in the portraits.
As you view all these governors' portraits, some are seated at or near a desk, some have books or flags. Governor Tim Pawlenty and Governor Mark Dayton, as is Governor Floyd Bjelsen, outside. How are the settings chosen?
Well, that's kind of a conversation between the artist and the governor. So they can pick and choose what they want as their setting. And for instance, with Pawlenty, it typifies this was the center of government. This is where he worked. This is where all of his achievements were made, was in that capital. With Governor Dayton, it's really acknowledging the importance of the state capitol, but he was also the leading official that led the preservation, restoration, repair of the capitol. So that's a part of his legacy. That's something that you want to be remembered. Not only did you serve here, but it's a place that you help preserve for future generations.
One portrait is distinctly different from the others, and that's the one of Governor Rudy Perpich, because it includes his wife Lola. What's the story behind that?
Well, the tradition for any governor portrait is to have just the governor as the person in that portrait. Governor Perpich had served non-consecutive terms, so he did have his first official portrait on display here, but because he had served a second term, he wanted to have that first portrait and a new portrait on display in the Capitol. And the Capitol area Architectural Planning Board said, well, you can only have one representation. And he wanted to have his painting with his wife, Lola. And so that brought up this whole controversy about it should be just the governor. And so he was asked not to have her in that painting. And so he had a campaign, basically put billboards on University Avenue, saying that they're not letting me and my wife in the building. So, it just became kind of a sticky issue for several years. And then after he passed away, the family and other supporters got money to do a portrait with Lola in that painting. So you'll see Lola and Rudy in the same painting today.
Each one of these portraits has a plaque next to it explaining the accomplishments of that governor's administration. Who writes those?
That's overseen by the Minnesota Historical Society. So we contract with historians or other people to write those biographical plaques and the information.
Is the content ever controversial?
That's the problem if you have portraits of living people or being portrayed. Sometimes it's hard to really tell their story because they're still living that story. So sometimes that can be a controversial issue. With the older governors, you have a little bit of time to really see what the permanence of that legislation they might have been supporting, the effect that has. So you have a better idea of the impact that governor did have 100 years ago.
In a sense, these portraits tell the history of the state through time. What do visitors, do they comment ever about these portraits?
There's a lot of people who will, as they're walking through the building, are curious. They want to see who these people are. They know some, they recognize some from their lifetime, and so they're interested in reading about them and seeing them portrayed here. And people usually comment, it's nice to see these portraits here because it does reflect that history of Minnesota and the different people that has served as that executive officer.
Join us again next week as we delve into more topics affecting Minnesotans. I'm Shannon Loehrke, and on behalf of all of us at Senate Media Services, thanks for watching.